Before the knock at his door that night, the only voices Nathaniel Quinn had heard in 8 years were the wind scraping across Zion Canyon and the restless dreams that never quite let him sleep. His cabin stood like a forgotten relic on the edge of the world, half buried in snow each winter, half swallowed by dust each summer, never once visited by another soul. That was how he liked it. Or so he told himself. Nathaniel wasn't always a ghost. Once he'd been a soldier, a builder of bridges, a man trusted with maps and steel. But Red Fork changed that. Not the battle, but the betrayal. A massacre framed as victory. Orders that came from men who would never bleed, delivered to men who bled too easily. He followed those orders once, and then he vanished. What he built now was silence. He stacked it like timber brick by brick, layer by layer, until no scream could reach him, no memory could claw its way back. And yet the past has a way of finding the living. It came in the form of a storm, one of those brutal mountain tempests that breaks the sky, open tears, branches from trees, and makes beasts burrow deep. Nathaniel was mending a boot by firelight when the first knock came, not polite, not timid, desperate, frantic. He froze. The second knock came harder, followed by voices. Soft, layered, urgent. Not in English. Apache. A tongue he hadn't heard since the night his wife screamed. 8 winters alone had dulled his sense of time, but not memory. He stood slowly, eyes locked on the door. His rifle was 3 feet above the mantel, untouched since he swore never to use it again. His hand moved toward it anyway. Then came the words, "Please. We need shelter." 10 women, soaked to the bone, stood huddled against the wind when he opened the door. Mud clung to their dresses. Blood stained their hems. The youngest clutched a bundle wrapped in torn wool, a baby barely alive. The oldest, her hair streaked with silver, held her head high, despite exhaustion. But it was the woman who spoke that held Nathaniel's gaze. Tall, eyes sharp as obsidian, a gash across her brow that had bled into her lashes. She did not beg, she declared. "My name is Delilah. These are my kin. We've been hunted for 3 days. We will die if you turn us away." Nathaniel looked past her into the night, saw nothing but knew enough to believe her. Storms didn't chase women like this. Men did. He stepped aside. They filed in without a word of thanks. Not out of rudeness. Out of the understanding that gratitude was a luxury. Survival was currency. As he closed the door behind them, the iron latch scraped like a guillotine. The storm howled louder, as if furious it had been denied its victims. The cabin transformed instantly. His solitude shattered. Every corner filled. Blankets pulled from chests. Coats hung near the hearth. A pot of water boiled. A baby coughed. Delilah approached him again. "You don't know what they did to us," she said. "Not yet, but you will." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "And when I do," she looked him dead in the eye, "then you'll have to decide what kind of man you really are." 8 years ago he would have answered without hesitation. Now the words lodged behind years of rust. He watched the women settle each with purpose. None idle, none weeping. They had the quiet urgency of wolves with pups nearby. Not prey, survivors. He poured a tin cup of coffee and sat by the fire staring into the flames like they might speak. But all they offered were shadows. Behind him the baby whimpered. The wind rattled the walls. Somewhere far off the faint clink of metal horses maybe, or ghosts. Nathaniel Quinn, the man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in a year, turned to Delilah. "You knew I wouldn't say no." "I hoped. That's different." He nodded. "You bring Ward to my door, Delilah." Her silence was the loudest sound in the room. "No," she said finally, "but we won't run from it anymore. And I think neither will you." Outside, the storm cracked open like a warning, and Nathaniel, for the first time in 8 winters, listened. They say silence is the language of ghosts, but that night the silence in Nathaniel Quinn's cabin was filled with voices that had learned how to survive war, not escape it. Long after the storm quieted into a drizzle and the women dried their feet by the hearth, Nathaniel remained in the shadows watching. He hadn't moved from his spot since letting them in, his body still but his thoughts racing like wild horses across the canyon. It wasn't just the wind anymore. There were sounds now. Whispers in Apache, the scrape of a blade being sharpened, the creak of wood under unfamiliar weight. Every movement in the room was deliberate. These weren't the flinching gestures of fear. These were actions honed by necessity, shaped by fire. Delilah stood near the fire, her face lit by flickering light. Nathaniel studied her. The wound above her brow had stopped bleeding, but her eyes held something deeper, a storm that didn't need thunder to be heard. "You never asked why we came here," she said without turning to face him. "I figured I'd get the truth when you were ready," Nathaniel replied. Delilah's voice was quiet. "We were told about you. A man who survived Red Fork and disappeared. A man who turned his back on the world but still sharpened his knives. We came because you've already lived through hell, and we're going back into it, but this time on our terms." Nathaniel finally stood, stretching, limbs stiff from hours of stillness. He walked toward the table where the others had laid out their meager supplies, dried meat, woven blankets, bandages. He noticed then that each woman carried something hidden, a blade, a small pistol, a hardened look. "You're not refugees," he said. "You're preparing for a fight." Delilah turned to him now. "We've been running for years, but we reached the edge. There's no more running, only choosing where we make our last stand." He looked around the room again. It was no longer his sanctuary. It had become something else, something living. Not just walls and wood, but breath and resolve. Mara, the quiet one with silver-threaded braids, stepped forward. She handed him a folded cloth. When he opened it, he found a crude map drawn with coal and blood. Trails, ridges, canyons. The paths they'd taken to escape, and the ones they planned to use. "They've killed our sons," she said, "burned our homes. And they think we'll keep running. They think fear is our only language, but they forget we remember names. We remember every scream." Delilah joined her. "We know Morrison is still hunting. We know Bradley gave him cover. What they don't know is that this place is where they lose." Nathaniel's eyes flicked to the corner where the baby slept. He said nothing for a long moment, then asked, "You think this cabin will hold off trained soldiers?" "No," Delilah said, "but you will." He laughed once, dry and low. 8 winters I spent burying my past. And now you want me to unearth it with gunpowder?" "Not just powder," she said. "Conviction." There was a time Nathaniel would have walked away from this madness. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the wind carrying the sound of hooves closer each hour. Maybe it was the way the women sharpened their weapons like priests polishing relics. Or maybe it was the fire building in his chest, the old fire, the kind that turns grief into fury. "You know they'll come at night," he said, finally accepting what had already been written. "Yes," Delilah answered. "Then we use the dark against them." The next hours passed without sleep. They moved through the cabin like shadows sealing windows, mapping escape tunnels, readying traps Nathaniel had buried years ago. A cache of explosives hidden beneath the kitchen floor. Iron spikes disguised as roots along the slope. Mirrors polished to flash signals across the ridge. The women worked without needing instruction. They had done this before. But what shook Nathaniel most wasn't their skill, it was their silence. The kind that didn't beg for rescue. the kind that had already buried the dead and made peace with dying. As dawn bled across the horizon, painting the canyon walls in crimson, Delilah placed a single wooden token on the table, carved roughly shaped like a hawk. "Morrison's brand," she said. "He burns it onto women. My sister still carries it on her back." Nathaniel didn't speak. He picked up the token and dropped it into the fire. It cracked as it burned. Outside, a new wind stirred, no longer howling, but carrying with it the sound of riders in the distance, men who thought they were chasing prey. Nathaniel turned to Delilah. "If this is where we make a stand," he said, "then we build a trap so deep they never crawl out." She nodded once. "And if we fall, then we fall together," Nathaniel replied. But not quietly, and for the first time in 8 winters he wasn't afraid of being heard. Some fires don't burn in the open, they smolder beneath the skin, quiet until the moment they're needed most. That night in a cabin high in Zion Canyon, a fire long buried inside Nathaniel Quinn finally came alive. The preparations had turned the place into something between a sanctuary and a war room. Furniture was upturned to form barricades. Oil lanterns were shifted to cast deceptive shadows. The cellar was stocked and sealed with just enough room to hide the youngest and the injured. But nobody planned on hiding long. Outside, the night was unnaturally still. The storm had passed, but in its wake came a silence so thick it pressed on the walls. Nathaniel stood at the only window left, unboarded, watching, listening. The moon cast pale light across the ridge. Shadows moved far off, too calculated to be animals. They were coming, and they thought they were invisible. "You remember the first man you ever killed?" Delilah asked quietly from the corner. Nathaniel didn't look at her. Not his face, just the moment before the way everything went quiet, like the earth itself held its breath. Delilah nodded. "That's when you know the world's about to change." Nathaniel turned from the window. His rifle was ready, its wood grip smooth from years of disuse, but still familiar in his hands. The weapon wasn't just steel, it was a memory. It was the weight of everything he once was. Across the room, Mara checked the baby one last time before handing her to the youngest woman, a girl named Annika, who would take shelter in the cellar. The child let out a faint, confused cry. No one flinched. "They won't expect us to fight," Mara said, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "They think we're ghosts, forgotten things." Delilah's voice was steady. "Then tonight we remind them why ghosts are feared." Nathaniel watched them, these women who had endured horrors he couldn't fully comprehend, and saw not weakness but resolve sharper than any blade. They had been wronged, scarred, chased, and they had come to this canyon not for protection but for retribution. "You could have kept running," he said. "You could have found some place to hide." "We're tired of hiding," Delilah replied. "And you aren't. You're tired of pretending you died 8 years ago." That struck deep. Nathaniel hadn't cried in years. Not when the reports of Red Fork were sealed. Not when the names of the dead were wiped clean. Not when he walked into the wilderness and left the world behind. But tonight, something cracked. Not tears, not grief. Something older rage rediscovered. He set his jaw and walked toward the fireplace. From behind the hearth he retrieved a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, sticks of dynamite, aged but intact. Delilah raised an eyebrow. "Railroad work," he said. "Before the war." She gave him a look halfway between admiration and warning. "Don't blow your whole house down with us inside it." He smiled grimly. "Only if we're losing." The room fell into a rhythm. Knives were tested, bullets counted, traps set in place. Every hand worked with precision, no need for orders. They had become a unit forged not by training, but by truth. Nathaniel hadn't felt this alive since the morning he left the army and never looked back. But in a quiet moment before the final defenses were locked in, he slipped outside. Just for a minute. Just to feel the cold night on his skin. He stood beneath the stars, breath rising like smoke, and looked east toward the trail. He thought of Mary the cook's daughter and her baby. They had gotten out. Maybe they'd make it. Maybe that counted for something. Then he saw a glint of metal in the distance, a man's silhouette. Then another. A full patrol moving like wolves around the edge of the cabin's defenses. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He turned back to the door where Delilah waited with her hand on her knife. "They're here," he said. And just like that, everything shifted. Inside, the flames burned lower. Every heartbeat felt louder than the wind. Delilah gathered the women with a glance. "We hold this ground. Not just for us. For every woman they silenced, for every voice they tried to erase." Nathaniel met her eyes and said what he hadn't said in nearly a decade. "I'm with you." And in that moment, the fire within him, the one he thought he'd buried beneath a mountain of guilt, rose like an inferno. He wasn't just a witness to this fight. He was part of it. They came in the dark, believing fear could open any door. But on this night, the door led only to reckoning. Captain Morrison's voice shattered the silence like a whip crack. "You have one chance, rancher. Hand over the women and no one else needs to die." Nathaniel Quinn didn't answer. He stood at the center of his cabin, the barrel of his rifle resting steady against the edge of the broken window. Around him, Delilah and the others crouched in the dark, weapons gripped, breaths silent. Outside, the soldiers moved like shadows. Their torches flickered between the trees, their boots crunching over soaked earth. They thought this was a raid, simple and swift. They thought they were hunting prey. They didn't know they had walked into a war. Nathaniel watched Morrison step into the clearing, his arrogance as loud as his voice. Behind him, 10 men fanned out rifles up, confident in their numbers. "You know what these women are accused of," Morrison called. "Sabotage, theft, murder." Delilah whispered behind Nathaniel. "And truth-telling. The one thing men like him fear most." Nathaniel adjusted his grip. Let him keep talking. He doesn't know it yet, but he's already dead. The signal came not from a flare, not from a shout, but from a flash of mirrored light reflected into the darkness. Mara, positioned near the ridge, had found her mark. Delilah's voice rang out cold and clear. "This land remembers every woman you tried to erase." Then the cabin erupted. Shots fired from the shadows. Knives found their targets in the chaos. Traps Nathaniel had laid years ago spiked pits, and snare lines snapped into motion. Men screamed as legs broke, as rifles flew from hands, as carefully choreographed violence turned their confidence to ash. Morrison dove for cover, shouting orders that were lost in the cacophony. Nathaniel moved like instinct, flanking through the back door, cutting off the soldiers attempting to circle around. One caught sight of him too late. A rifle cracked. Another fell. Inside the cabin, Delilah moved like a specter. Silent, precise, unstoppable. One by one, they brought the house's defenders into the open. These weren't frightened women, they were warriors. They had chosen this battlefield not out of desperation, but out of design. And Morrison had never seen it coming. He stumbled to his feet, trying to regroup his remaining men, but panic was already settling in. Their lines were broken, their traps triggered. And worst of all, Morrison saw the look in Nathaniel's eyes as he stepped into the torchlight. "You were at Red Fork," Morrison said, more stunned than afraid. Nathaniel nodded once. "You were too. I remember your orders. I remember the bodies." "You were a soldier, I was a witness," Nathaniel interrupted. "Now I'm your sentence." Delilah appeared beside him, blade flashing. Morrison reached for his sidearm, but his hand froze mid-motion. Something in Delilah's eyes made him hesitate. He saw not vengeance, he saw clarity. The kind that doesn't forgive, the kind that doesn't flinch. "For my sister," she whispered, then lunged. The fight ended before Morrison's body hit the ground, but silence didn't follow. From the distance, the thunder of hooves broke across the canyon like the drum of war. Reinforcements. Nathaniel turned toward the sound. Torches again. A dozen, maybe more. Delilah looked to him. Colonel Bradley Nathaniel's jaw clenched. And half a company if he brought what he promised. The surviving women, only 7, now regrouped, bloodied but breathing. "We can't hold this place again," Mara said, "not with those numbers." "There's another way," Nathaniel said. They ran behind the cabin, past the trees to where the land sloped downward into the ravine. At its base sat a crude dam Nathaniel had built years before to catch spring floodwaters. Now, with the storm's recent downpour, it was full to the brim. "You blow the dam, they drown," Delilah said. "But we lose everything." Nathaniel looked back at the cabin, charred bloodied a battlefield reborn from a prison. "I already did," he said. "This place died with Sarah. I just didn't bury it until tonight." He placed the charges by hand, wrapped the fuses in oilcloth, and lit the flame with the same matchbook he'd once used to burn his last military uniform. The rumble began slow. Then the earth cracked, and when the dam broke, the canyon roared. The cavalry never reached the cabin. They found only water and wreckage, and Morrison's mark carved into the mud washed clean by justice. As dawn painted the sky in shades of copper and flame, Delilah turned to Nathaniel and asked, "Do you think they'll come again?" He stared into the sunrise rifle slung across his back. Let them. Because this time the West remembered. The first light of morning spilled over the jagged cliffs of Zion Canyon, painting the landscape in gold and blood. Smoke curled from the wreckage where the cabin once stood now, just splinters and scorched earth. What remained wasn't ruin. It was transformation. Nathaniel Quinn stood at the edge of the hill, his boots buried in damp ash, watching the sun climb. Every breath he took felt foreign, heavy with the weight of survival. He should have felt hollow after the loss of everything he had built. But instead, he felt something else. Relief. Below Delilah and the other surviving women gathered what little they had salvaged: blankets, weapons, memories. The baby, swaddled tight in Mara's arms, let out a sharp, defiant cry that echoed across the canyon like a promise. Life against all odds had endured. They had won, but not without cost. 3 of their own lay buried in shallow graves beside the cabin's remains. The ground was too hard to dig deeper, but they marked the earth with stones and prayers. Nathaniel carved their names into a beam from the cabin's frame and stood at upright headstones for warriors who died on their feet. Delilah approached quietly. Her coat was torn, her hair streaked with soot, but her eyes burned with the same fire that had carried them through the longest night of their lives. "We'll leave at first light," she said. "Head north. There are safe places still. Relatives, tribes untouched for now." Nathaniel nodded. "And when they come for answers, they'll find none here," she said. "Only smoke, only silence." He turned to her fully. "They'll call it an act of rebellion, terrorism. They can call it whatever helps them sleep. We know what it was." He looked again at the sun cresting the canyon wall. "What will you do after?" Delilah didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the baby, then at the others, each one carrying the scars of last night etched into their skin and soul. "Live," she said finally. "Tell stories. Raise our dead in words if we can't do it in earth. And make damn sure our daughters grow up with knives in their belts and fire in their hearts." He smiled faintly. That's not peace." "No," she said, "but it's justice." They fell silent again, not from discomfort, but from the weight of knowing they had rewritten their fates with fire and fury. A new chapter would begin at the edge of that sunrise. Nathaniel walked one last circle around the hilltop, taking in the landscape that had sheltered him for nearly a decade. He remembered Sarah's laughter here, the garden they had once planted together, the stars they used to count on the roof. Now it was hallowed ground and altar to choice to sacrifice. "Where will you go?" Delilah asked. "West," he said. "I hear there's land in California that needs rebuilding. They won't know me there." She tilted her head. "You think you're done running?" He looked her in the eye. "No, I think I finally started living." They clasped hands, not as survivors, but as allies bound by something deeper than vengeance. Around them, the others mounted their horses. The baby cooed again, louder now, as if sensing the coming journey. Nathaniel watched them ride out one by one toward a horizon not yet written. Delilah was the last to go. She paused at the edge of the trail. "You ever find yourself in Denver?" she said. "Look for a woman who teaches her students to speak truth like it's a weapon." "I'll remember that," he said. She smiled. "Good, because we're not done rewriting history." And then she was gone. Nathaniel stayed until the last hoofbeats faded, until the wind carried only birdsong and silence. He buried the last of the supplies beneath a tree, where the soil stayed cool, left behind the rifle that had once been his lifeline, and took only what he could carry. As he walked west, he didn't look back. Some stories don't need retelling, but this one needed remembering. And if it stirred something in you, if the fire that burned in those canyon shadows still flickers in your chest, then let it live. Share it. Speak it. Because the Wild West was never about the land. It was always about the people brave enough to fight for it. And their fire still burns. Subscribe to the channel for more untold stories like this, because the next one might just be the wildest yet. As Nathaniel reached the last ridge overlooking the valley, he spotted something that didn't belong: hoof prints, fresh and erratic, cut into the muddy trail leading west. He knelt, tracing them with a fingertip. Too light for cavalry, too narrow for freight. A single rider, and fast. He followed the trail down, the slope rifle slung but ready. The wind carried something sharp beneath the scent of pine smoke, faint but fresh. Not from the cabin. 2 miles out, he found her. Delilah lay beneath a twisted cottonwood, her horse dead beside her, arrow protruding from its neck. Blood soaked her left side, and her breath came in sharp, rattling gasps. Her eyes flickered open as he approached, and a weak smile touched her lips. "They were waiting," she whispered. "A patrol, not from Bradley's unit. Scouts." I doubled back to throw them off the others. He pressed a cloth to the wound, panic clawing beneath his ribs. "You should have stayed with them. I couldn't risk leading death to the girls." Nathaniel looked over his shoulder, senses flaring. She had saved them again at a cost. "You're not dying here," he muttered, lifting her carefully. "Don't lie to me now," she rasped. "Just tell the story, make it mean something." As he cradled her in his arms, the sky above began to lighten again, the second dawn in as many days. He knew then that history wouldn't remember the names of these women unless someone carved them into memory. And he would be that someone. If this story moved you, if these lives mattered to you even for a moment, subscribe to the channel. Help us keep these legends alive. Because for every tale that's told, there are 100 more buried beneath the dust, waiting for someone brave enough to dig.